Brian Simon. The title of his talk is The Hamlet Fire and the Hidden Deadly Costs of Cheap and Recent American History. Brian Simon is an award-winning history professor from Temple University and author of 3 books. In his new book, and in this talk, he investigates the tragic 1991 chicken processing plant fire in the small town of Hamlet, North Carolina. This was one of the worst accidents in recent American history, resulting in 25 deaths behind their locked doors. He interviews with survivors, first responders, workplace safety experts, and local business professionals, make a hard-hitting social autopsy of this gruesome event. Please welcome Brian Simon.
Well, good morning. Thanks everybody for coming, and thanks to the Ethical Society for having me. What I want to do this morning is talk about my book. I'll read a little bit from it, but also really try and talk about this moment in 1991 where 25 working people died behind locked doors, and try and make some sense of it, both in the past, I'm a history professor, but also its resonance for now. In the fall of 1991, the fire happened on September 3rd, 1991, the day after Labor Day. I was living in North Carolina, working on my dissertation, and every morning the newspaper would plop down on my door, and the coverage of this fire was really amazing. And it's just one kind of reminder about this. I can see many of the people in the room are old enough to remember this, just how good newspapers were. And it didn't matter if you were in a small town or a medium-sized city or even here in Philadelphia, there was extensive coverage of things. And so it was that investment that people had made in their local papers that actually brought the event to me. And so every morning I learned something more about this fire. I learned about the people who died in this fire. Most of them were single mothers. Most of them were African American. And most of them were desperate for work. I learned about the town of Hamlet, North Carolina, one time railroad center of the South, the birthplace, some of you might know of John Coltrane, and also of Tom Wicker, the famed New York Times reporter who would cover the Attica uprising and be intimately involved in it. And for Philadelphians, you might know, this is also Mike Quick's hometown, the Eagles color announcer. He actually had worked in the factory before it became a chicken processing plant. I learned about the owners of the factory, a father-son team from Moosic, Pennsylvania, who had moved south to find themselves in a place that lent themselves to higher profits. I learned that the plant there had never had a fire drill, that it didn't have sprinklers, and it had never been inspected. And as I kind of came to understand these details about this fire and about the people who worked there, I decided that I would write a book about this fire and try and make sense of it and try and make sense of what happened. And so the first thing I did was I went to Hamlet, North Carolina, about 20 years to the date after the fire, and I met with 3 local journalists who had covered the event. And one of them, in fact, was a firefighter that had gone there actually as a journalist to cover the fire, and he was also a volunteer fireman. He became involved in the attempt to put out the fire. And so I talked to him that day, and we were sitting in a restaurant. Actually, the restaurant wasn't even in Hamlet because Hamlet was so depleted it didn't have a place to eat by that point. And we're sitting around on this diner table, and they said to me, "Look, there's no real social meaning to this fire. It was an accident. It was 2 guys, employers, who just locked the doors. And if they hadn't locked the doors, we wouldn't be sitting here." And I thought about that for a long time after meeting with them. An accident. What does an accident mean? An accident means that 2 people do something out of the ordinary and there's consequences. But by calling it an accident, you erase the deep social and political actions that had led to that moment. I mean, in a sense, right, we witnessed this in the wake of Katrina. When people insisted that the flooding of New Orleans after, right, the hurricane was an accident. That it was an accident that the poorest and most vulnerable people in New Orleans were the ones who were victimized by the flooding. But there's another way to see things. And my book, in many ways, is that other way. I argue and try to explain in the book that the fire that left 25 people dead behind locked doors was part of a system. A system that I call of cheap. And what I suggest in the book is that in many ways the United States, from really the 1970s, from the kind of economic crises of the 1970s forward, a new way of imagining the social contract takes shape in the United States. Before the 1970s, really, between the early part of the 20th century into the 1970s, the kind of broad social contract in the United States was built around what we might call notions of Fordism. The idea, right, if you think about Henry Ford, right, in the early part of the 20th century, he's having trouble keeping people at work. And he's having trouble selling cars at a certain point. And when he comes up with this idea, how about if I pay my workers $5 a day? That was twice the going rate at the time. And Ford did this for two reasons. One, he did it because if he paid his workers more, they might show up for work. The second was, he thought that if he paid his workers more, he'd have a larger number of people who could buy Model Ts. And for much of the 20th century, the idea was the goal of social policy should be to increase aggregate demand. Have more people making more money to buy more stuff. If you think about the kind of metaphor of the pie, the idea was if the pie could keep expanding, people would have more to spend. But after 1973 and after a kind of global shift in the economy, I would argue a different kind of social imagining takes place. A social imagining described as what I would call cheap. And the idea is, if the pie is going to get smaller, we got to make it easier for business to make money, and hopefully the cost of the pie will cost, the pieces of the pie will cost less. So we need to deregulate. We need to not inspect factories. We need to let businesses do what they want to do. And hopefully it will all work out. And what I would argue is this system that we put in place, this system of cheap, is prodigious in one sense, and that is in hiding its actual costs. Hiding its actual cost of the factory in Hamlet, the Imperial Food Products plant, made chicken tenders and chicken nuggets. The chicken tenders it made sold for $1.99, a drink and fries included, at Shoney stores in the South. So what I want to suggest is, right, what does it take to make $1.99 chicken tenders? Because that is the cause of the fire. What it costs to make cheap food, and what has to be hidden in the process. And the first thing I would argue that has to happen is that you have to make people vulnerable. And so I just want to read a little bit from the beginning of my book. It's about Loretta Goodwin, a woman who works in the factory, one of these people who has been made vulnerable. A blessing and a curse. That's how Loretta Goodwin described her job at the Imperial Food Products plant. She started processing chicken tenders at the rambling one-story red brick factory in Hamlet, North Carolina, on September 14th, 1989, not long after celebrating her 40th birthday. She didn't mind the job as much as some of her coworkers. Maybe that's because she knew what hard work was. One of 16, she had left school in the 10th grade to pick cotton, tobacco, and peaches to help her family get by. In her 20s, she served up barbecue sandwiches and cleaned up other people's houses, done their laundry, and made their breakfasts and dinners. She was glad to be out of the hot sun and buggy fields, and she was glad to be out of white people's kitchens and pantries. She was especially glad to leave the nursing home where she had worked for a dozen years before coming to Imperial. She liked that she could weigh a 5.5-ounce chicken breast in her hand without using a scale. She liked that she could keep up with the speeding production line while others fell behind. What she didn't like about the job was the sour smell of chicken that clung to her long after her shift ended, or the ice-cold water that dripped off the meat and puddled on the floors, seeping into her shoes and then her socks. She didn't like how the ceaseless repetition of picking up and putting down frozen blocks of boneless chicken breast made it feel like there was something inside her hands and fingers pinching at her flesh. She didn't like how her white supervisors hollered at her and sometimes made fun of her clothes and her weight. And she didn't like that she had to ask them to use the bathroom, or that they sometimes timed her trips to the toilet with a stopwatch and threatened to fire her if she went for too long or too often. Still, Goodwin thanked God for the work. She made $5.50 an hour. That was $1.25 above the federal minimum wage at the time. On payday, she brought home a check of $179. A single mom with 5 kids, 3 still living with her, and no regular support from her former husband that she could depend on, Goodwin was glad, proud even, to be eking out a living in a place where a steady job and an hourly rate above minimum wage was as hard to find as a cool breeze in summer or a street without a church on it. You couldn't get much better around here, Goodwin reflected, assessing the labor market in the 1990s for black women like herself, and increasingly for white women and men across the color line as well, in her hometown and so many other places across the country where good jobs had disappeared and unions had faded from the scene. But Goodwin's steady paycheck didn't change everything. After almost 2 years on the job, she remained one fall on the slippery floors, one sick child, or one missed shift because of her stiff hands away from sinking below the poverty line. On Tuesday, September 3rd, 1991, the day after Labor Day, the buzzing of the alarm clock woke Goodwin up just before dawn. She didn't feel like getting out of bed that morning. Something made her feel uneasy about the day ahead. But she did what she always did. She shuffled around her rented house getting ready, avoiding the creaks in the floor so she wouldn't wake up her children. A little after 7 a.m., she got into her car and drove to work. She felt the thickness of late summer in the air as she drove through town under overcast skies, passing convenience stores, aging hotels in need of repair, and the town's signature building, the Victorian-era train depot with its gables and intricate woodwork. After taking a left on Main Street, she made a right on Bridges Street. She drove up the hill to the Imperial plant and parked her car on Bridges Street. She didn't notice a tractor-trailer at the loading dock, or the driver asleep at the wheel. Once inside, Goodwin stowed her lunch in her locker and sat down in the break room. She started to tell her co-workers about how local police had picked up her nephew on some undisclosed charge over the weekend. Before all the details came out, she put on a hairnet and a blue plastic smock, grabbed a pair of gloves, and took her place on the line. It was 8 a.m. 22 minutes later, she would look behind her and see a fireball that she described the size of the front end of a Lincoln Continental gathering behind her. It turned out that a hydraulic line attached with the wrong parts because the owners refused to spend the money on the right parts blew and sprayed flammable hydraulic fluid everywhere, including under burners that should have been turned off, that were heating the fryer that cooked the chicken tenders. She didn't know which way to go that morning when the fire happened. Again, they'd never had a fire drill at the plant. She ran unable to see because the fire, fueled by the chicken grease that was all over the plant, quickly turned into this dark black. She couldn't see the hand in front of her face, and she ran to the back doors of the factory, only to find them locked. She and her co-workers kicked at the door, but they couldn't get it to come down. They didn't know that the door only opened to the inside, which again is a fundamental violation of any kind of safety regulation. 12 of her co-workers ran into a cooler, hoping that the cooler would save them from the flames. What they didn't know was this was a door that didn't work in the factory, and that the carbon monoxide that the fire was producing seeped into the cooler and killed them while they sat in there trying to protect themselves. 13 of her co-workers would die in other parts of the factory. Goodwin herself would eventually get out after a firefighter hatcheted the door that she was at. She popped outside onto the ground, a survivor, Though she would spend the rest of her life dealing with post-traumatic stress disorder. To this day, she still deals with post-traumatic stress disorder. But again, she would consider herself one of the lucky ones. Luckier than Fred and Barrington and his mother. Barrington, the son, actually escaped the fire only to run back into the plant to save his mom, and they both died together in the plant. Luckier than Philip Dawkins, who was a snack delivery man, who normally came to the plant on Mondays, but because of Labor Day, he came early that Tuesday morning to stock the vending machines in the break room. He would die in that break room. There, too, the door was locked because the owners didn't want workers leaving the plant for a smoke break. And Dawkins' body, like all the bodies, would be put on dollies and moved to the loading dock after the fire was subdued, and the bodies would be handed down to a firefighter who would then take them to an ambulance. Actually, it was the back of a refrigerated meat truck that was cleared out and used as a temporary morgue in the town. And Dawkins' body was handed down to a firefighter who turned out to be his son, who was a volunteer firefighter and didn't know that his dad was there that day. The son, probably not shockingly, would suffer from his own post-traumatic stress disorder, and that 2 or 3 years after the fire, he would regularly set fires around town. And 5 years after the fire, would murder his wife and try and bury her in the bottom of a lake. And I don't say this just for the sensational parts of it, but to sort of get a sense of the kind of collateral damage. Again, what I was trying to do in my book was to write a social autopsy of this fire, to kind of, in a sense, interrogate the causes of this fire, and build these around this system of cheat. But in part, when you're thinking about a system, right, you think about the way in which people's choices are actually are constrained, right? That the system produces certain results, and if you think about it as a system, really, all of the players in this drama were trapped in this system. The town of Hamlet, for instance, was trapped in this system. Hamlet, as I read that one detail, had long been actually a pretty high-wage place. It was a railroad town. But in the 70s and the 80s, the railroads begin to close up in Hamlet, and Hamlet is desperate for employers. Desperate for somebody who will give people a job. And when the Rhodes, this family from Moosic, Pennsylvania, who had been dogged by a union and dogged by OSHA in Pennsylvania, were looking for a new place to locate, basically the town of Hamlet said, please come here. They sent them letters kind of urging them to come here. And they rewarded them for coming there by basically saying, look, you can do whatever you want. And they felt like they had to do that in order to sort of maintain tax revenues. And so just one example of this plant had 3 fires before the fatal fire of 1991, yet the fire company never inspected the plant. The day of the fire, the firefighters didn't even know where the main water supply was. They had no kind of pre-treatment plant. North Carolina felt like it was stuck in this system. It felt like it would do anything, right, to kind of encourage employers from other parts of the country to locate here. And I'll give you again another example of this. You might ask, like, why was this factory never inspected? The state of North Carolina, kind of amazingly, in 1990 was the most industrial state in America per capita. Few people will know this. More industrial than Pennsylvania, Michigan, Ohio. It had 180,000 workplaces. Yet it only had 40 factory inspectors. That meant if those factory inspectors inspected one factory a day, every day, it would take them 72 years to inspect every plant in the state. That meant that Emmett and Bradbury, the owners of that plant, could lock the doors and know no one was going to ever find out. It meant that they could use faulty equipment and not fix it to save on their bottom line because they were never going to get caught. And they too, in some ways, the owners of the plant were caught in this system. They were caught in a desperately competitive system in which cheap was the value. The cheaper the food, the better. If they had wanted to abide by safety regulations, they would have put themselves in a competitive disadvantage in this system. So they did what made logical sense to them. They cut corners. They locked doors. They ratcheted up production. They risked people's lives to make their own kind of profits. And the workers themselves, in many ways, were caught in this system. Loretta Goodwin had no choice but to go to work that morning. She needed a job. She needed a job to help pay her bills, to help take care of her children, to help get by. She missed the shift. She fell behind. And Loretta Goodwin herself also knew that she was trapped in a system that silenced her. She would tell me when I interviewed her several times, and she said one of her friends one day was complaining about the conditions to the owners, and she told her friend to be quiet. Not because she thought this was a great place to work, not because she liked the owners, because she feared that if they complained, the plant would move. And if it moved, she wouldn't have a job, and there'd be no way to take care of things. And so she kept quiet. She kept quiet about the rickety machines, the lack of sprinklers, the lack of fire drills. She was caught in a system. And indeed, the workers were caught in a system in terms of food as well. What this system offered, right, was cheap food. In many ways, the kind of reduction of the cost of food actually kept the system going. It could pay workers less, but they would be able to get food that would sustain them. But the food that they constantly had to rely on was dangerous for them. It was highly breaded fried chicken tenders. And if you actually look at a map, if you map rates of obesity in the United States, they begin to pick up exactly in the 1970s. Exactly when? Exactly when wages fall in the United States. Just like Henry Ford, who imagined his workers getting off the assembly line buying a Ford, Emmett Rowe imagined his workers getting off a shift at Imperial and buying the chicken tenders they made. They were easy, calorie-dense, and cheap. And again, an interesting, when I went through and looked at the death reports of the workers, if you plugged in their height and weight, 18 of the 25 people who died would be considered overweight. Literally, they were forced to eat the food that they made in order to survive. And so, it's a system in many ways, right, that sort of people are involved in. But this system relies on one other thing, and that's silence. The silence of workers. Deregulation is a form of silence. Regulations are attempts to bring light to conditions. To not regulate is to enforce silence. This system relies on the ability of chicken producers to dump urine, feces, and dead chickens into holes in the ground that affect the water system. It involves the systematic torture of animals. You can't have $1.99 chicken tenders without essentially torturing animals. It involves every single worker in this plant suffered from some form of carpal tunnel syndrome or tendinitis. You couldn't have this system without abusing the bodies of workers who often then would have to leave their jobs and go on public assistance at the cost of somebody else. So this world of cheap creates a lie about the price of things. Shoney sold the chicken tenders made in Imperial Food Products for $1.99, but that price is a lie. But it can't function without that lie not being called attention to. And so this idea of cheap, right, involves a system that locks people in it, that limits their choices about where to work, what to eat, what to say, but also a kind of larger system of silence. And I just want to talk for just a couple minutes about the aftermath of this case, because I think you can also see the costs of cheap playing out. In the aftermath of the fire, lawyers descended on Hamlet, and I mean this almost literally. One of them was actually Greta Van Susteren, the woman on Fox News. Her husband was one of the lawyers, and they flooded into town. At one point, there were so many lawyers roaming the halls of the hospital in town that the police had to come out and get the lawyers out. They were trying to sign workers up on their to sue the company. The lawyers would call church pastors and say, if you get me 2 of your parishioners to sign up with me, I'll get you a new roof for your church. And for workers, right, they thought that settlements, legal settlements, would form a kind of justice, right? That someone like Loretta Goodwin had suffered this horrible kind of fate, and that somehow justice would come through the legal system. And there were settlements. And Loretta Goodwin got $35,000. Because why? She was 40 years old. They calculated her life's earnings based on a job at $5 an hour. And that's what her life was worth. It was $35,000. Less than a semester at Penn for someone's life. And so the sense of restitution and justice that workers sought in the wake of the case was something that became incredibly elusive. And I want to just point out in one other way that there was a kind of elusiveness formed by Cheap in the wake of it. This plant, this factory, this is the kind of image of the factory here. It sat on the black side of town in Hamlin, and I mean that in a kind of meaningful distinction. Hamlin in 1991 was the place where the civil rights movement and kind of racial change were marginal at best. The town was still kind of had a geography of race that people understood, and so this plant was on the black side of town, which a year after the fire, the plant was still up. 2 years after the fire, the plant was still up. 5 years after the fire, the plant was still up. 10 years after the fire, the plant was still up. That meant for African American families, when they went to church, they had to pass the plant. When they drove their kids to school, they had to pass the plant. When they wanted to go to the Piggly Wiggly, the only grocery store in town, they had to pass the plant. And then they were terrorized, as people kind of observed by it, because this was the place where their lives had been rendered, had been shattered and torn apart. And the reason why the plant still sat there was because the town of Hamlin was unwilling to spend $30,000 or $40,000 to take it down. They wanted to use that money for something else. And cheap, right? I mean, this kind of sense that some people's lives are more valuable than others. And the kind of people who worked in this plant, people of color, largely women, weren't worth this kind of investment in this place. And so, for the people who worked in this plant, who survived the fire and whose families survived the fires, this was a daily reminder that they were not important. And so I just want to talk about one kind of issue about aftermath. Many of you, as I've been talking, I suspect had thought about the Triangle Factory fire in New York in 1911, where more than 100 women who worked in a clothing factory died behind locked doors, and many were forced to jump out the windows of that 5 and 7. The plant was on the 5th and 7th floor of that plant in the Lower East Side of New York, and they died as their bodies hit the pavement of Lower Manhattan. And this is an interesting parallel, right? People dying in a plant where their safety is compromised to make money. Here's where the parallel doesn't work. Triangle led to a fundamental rethinking of the relationship between government and manufacturers. Literally, the people who would be the architects of a New Deal social order, of a social order that imagined increasing aggregate demand, the need for regulations, were the children of Triangle. Frances Perkins, the first woman to be a cabinet secretary, was deeply moved by what happened at Triangle. Eleanor Roosevelt was deeply moved by what happened at Triangle. Al Smith became a reformer. I mean, he was a kind of hack Tammany Hall politician before that. Became deeply committed to reform. And so did Franklin Roosevelt. In the wake of the Imperial plant fire, the state of North Carolina enacted some reforms. It had a whistleblower law. There was some increased regulation from fire marshals. They had to inspect plants, and the state hired 4 more factory inspectors. So it would take 52 years to inspect every factory in the state. Here is a disaster that does not create fundamental change and reform and rethinking about the social system. That's the difference between Imperial and Triangle. And what I would argue is that the factory fire at Hamlet gets quickly forgotten. And the ideas of CHEAP continue to animate government life today. We only need to look at the current kind of wave of deregulation going on now, and the promises made about deregulation. They are the same promises made in the 70s and the same promises made by the Reagan regime in the 1980s. And they are sure to create a kind of loss for the most vulnerable people in America. They already are now. We just can't see them yet. It takes a disaster sometimes for us to see things and to understand that disasters almost always reveal a system that's broken. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much for listening.